Just a gentle note before we begin. Today's episode includes discussion of grief, loss, and caregiving. Please listen in a way that feels supportive for you. You're welcome to pause and come back at any time. There's a kind of grief that doesn't come with a funeral. It comes in small moments when your loved one changes, when you realize they can't do what they used to. When a conversation feels different, when the future you thought you had quietly disappears. And many caregivers don't call this grief because no one died and you're still needed and the day still has to run. So they minimize it, they push it down, they keep going. But the body keeps the score. The tight chest, the short fuse, the numbness, the tears that show up in the car, and the feeling that everyone else has moved on while you're still in the in-between. Today's guest is here to name that experience with so much care. Victoria Volk is the creator of the Unleashed Heart, and she supports people moving through loss with a grief-sensitive, body-aware approach. No fixing, no urgency, and no bypassing. She's an advanced certified grief recovery specialist and an end-of-life doula, and the host of the Grieving Voices podcast. She brings a unique perspective shaped by being a child griever and by the life experience that followed. This episode is for the caregiver living the long goodbye, and for anyone carrying invisible loss while still showing up for everyone else. Victoria, welcome to Radiant Moments.
Thank you for that wonderful intro. My pleasure.
Victoria, for caregivers meeting you for the very first time, could you please take us to the moment you realised grief needed a different kind of support than what most of us are taught, and share how that shaped the work you're doing today?
So my story began in childhood, as you mentioned in the introduction. My grandmother had been diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma, so my mother was caring for her. At the same time, my father had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. So between the age of 6 and 7, when my grandmother passed away, a year later, when I was 8, my father passed. So as you can imagine, my mother, as a caregiver for both her mother and her husband, she didn't have the tools or the emotional capacity really to parent myself anyway. I'm the youngest of 4. There's a 5-year age gap between my brother and I, and then a 9-year age gap between myself and my oldest sister, and even more of a gap between myself and my half brother, who was an adult at that time. My experience growing up was being shuffled around, lack of stability, a lack of caregiving really, and how I was feeling, what I was experiencing. But also in hindsight, I can, with empathy, put myself in my mother's shoes now, knowing what I know about grief, and have compassion for her, where I had a lot of anger, honestly, and a lot of resentment into my teen years and growing up, because not only did I lose my close loved ones, right? But when my father passed away, I also lost that entire side of the family. They were no longer in our lives. So grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. So it was a lot to take as a child and try to process on my own. And as children, we make up stories and we come to our own conclusions if no one tells us differently, right? And what followed, though, after those losses was I was molested. And so when I shared that with my mother, she was kind of indifferent to it. Nothing really changed or nothing happened. So growing up, I just felt really dismissed. But again, knowing what I know now, I mean, I see where the rage and the anger came from. But I can also look at her life experience and what she experienced even before those experiences, those losses she had, and how that impacted her caregiving and parenting of me. I can look at that with empathy. I looked at when my children were 8, I couldn't help but look at them and know, like, they would know if something happened to me. If I died, they would understand it. And there's just so much misunderstanding about the capacity of children and what they understand and what they know, that we always hear too that children are resilient. Well, children don't have a choice. They learn to adapt. They're probably the best at adaptability because they don't have a choice, don't have a sense of self agency like you do as an adult. So, yeah, how that shaped my work today is I have been both on the receiving end of lack of caregiving. I've seen how difficult it can be for caregivers and to be that it's like a sandwich, right? That sandwich of I should be here and I need to be there and I can't be everything to everyone. And how do I even care for myself at the same time? I am a mom, I am a parent, I have 3 kids, but I think that grief and that seeing the contrast has greatly shaped my work with people.
And I hear very truly that each person's experience at that time, because that everyone was at a different point in their life and their age, and what they'd experienced up until that point was substantially different. And that impacted how information was interpreted, what information was shared, what information wasn't shared, which then has that knock-on effect when processing grief, when trying to make sense of the world around you when those significant life events happen. And for so many caregivers, they don't identify as grievers, even when they're carrying loss every day, because they have these responsibilities. They have to show up, they still have to be present, and there may not be the bandwidth to be able to stop and address how they're feeling or address the impact of that grief. In your work, what makes grief hard to name, especially for people who are still functioning and still needed day to day, really?
I think what happens is people get really good at compartmentalizing. Like, how can your brain even like wrap around and comprehend and like take in everything that it needs to take in, much less just living as a human in 2026, right? But also then, like you said, showing up for your loved ones, your spouse, your significant other, your children, parent, all the people in your life, right? And all the different hats that we wear as mothers and caregivers and parents and all the things. And I think you get really good at compartmentalizing just as a means to survive. You become really good at highly functioning, but the body does, like you said, keep the score. And eventually, like we're like a tea kettle. We either implode or we explode. And I think that kind of speaks to the burnout you're talking about. Is it burnout or is it just this having to perform and having to this level of self-sacrifice that you didn't ask for? Like no one asks for that. So it can either manifest as these physical symptoms, migraines, fibromyalgia, heart issues, high blood pressure, anxiety, stress. I was listening to a podcast not that long ago. It was all about stress and anxiety. And the guest was she's a physician. She was speaking to the ACEs study. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard it, I haven't read it though.
So the ACEs study, what it stands for is adverse childhood experiences. And there's been a revision of, I guess, I haven't read it myself, but she said there's been a revision to the ACEs study where what they're finding now is that 1 in 6 adults has 4 or more ACEs. And an ACE would be a child whose parent was incarcerated, child whose parent struggled with mental illness or substance abuse disorder or died or was molested or had sexual trauma or experience. Like there's a whole list of things, right? Trauma is what happens and grief is what's left. That's what I speak to. And so anyway, with these ACEs, however you've experienced life as a child, it's going to impact and influence your adulthood unless you've connected the dot and looked at those things and sat with that grief, the undelivered communications, the anger, the resentment that I held. I had to get rid of that, but it took me 30 years to do so. But also the joy, right? The things that you couldn't say or didn't have an opportunity to say, especially if it was a loving relationship. And that's difficult too, right? The unloving relationships, people who are still living in our lives, or even if they did pass away and it wasn't the best of relationships. There's grief in all of it. And so as a tea kettle, we either implode or explode. And explode, we either have these anger outbursts or resort to behaviors that make us feel better for a short period of time. We call them STIRBs for short. And things like alcohol or substances, right? Shopping, gambling, relationships, like constantly scrolling, using social media, anything that makes you feel better for a short period of time. Even exercise. It's healthy, it's good for you, but even that can be a means to not address and really feel what it is that you're afraid to feel.
And I think that's such a genuine point to look at how grief manifests in a person's body when we don't take the time to be gentle with ourselves when we're going through that process. And you speak to grief from lived experience. We're talking about how grief can show up in different ways and not just from the cause of death. It can be grief of watching your loved one fade away, lose their memory, and not remember who you are. When a loved one has a severe disability, the grief of them not having the experiences that other children in your lives have. Maybe not being able to drive, maybe not ever own a home. The things that our hopes and dreams that we had at the start that are no longer there. What are the most common ways that caregivers or people accidentally dismiss their own grief when we're looking at it from a holistic approach of not just death, but other areas of our lives where we can have this grief from, even from the trauma of watching your loved one go through a medical procedure that's distressing?
I just don't think we connect the dots. I mean, I can speak from personal experience, 30 years, right? It took me 30 years to learning new tools and new education to realize that grief was my problem. What happened was, though, I had another loss. Actually, my father's brother had been diagnosed with brain cancer, and he was one of the people I last saw at my father's funeral and hadn't since. But I went to go see him. I felt this draw to go see him, and we reconnected over the next 6 months that followed until he passed. And it was a very beautiful healing experience for me, and I think for him as well. But I didn't know, was he going to recognize me? Does he even want to see me? Like, I had no clue. I just felt this pull to go see him. But what happened after that was like, this is grief. Like, that's my issue. Like, this opened up. It's the scab had been pulled off, right? And I was all of a sudden flooded with all these feelings again and realized this is grief. Like, grief is my issue here. And up to that point, all the physical manifestations I'd been experiencing, I didn't connect it to grief. I just thought losing my hair, and I honestly thought I was struggling with a mental illness. I honestly believed that there was really something wrong with me. I was questioning, am I bipolar? Because I would have these really high highs and these really low lows, and my self-care was in the toilet. And I'd pulled myself together long enough that I had to when my kids were around, and when they weren't, it's like I didn't care about myself. So yeah, it takes a level of self-awareness to connect those dots for yourself.
And it's that unacknowledged grief when you don't realize, or you're not seeing the dots that are coming, that especially hit hard when you're switched on. If you're heightened, if your adrenaline and cortisol is going, hard rooms like hospitals, school, offices, medical appointments, they become harder because you're already at a level 9. And so trying to regulate yourself, trying to find a balance in that space, if you're not able to recognize that the things that you've experienced have caused trauma, which result in grief for yourself and your loved one. And most of the time, caregivers are experiencing grief from both sides. They feel grief for the child or their loved one who's gone through the medical challenge, but then also having to witness what they won't remember because they're either asleep or they're in so much pain that their brain has compartmentalized, like you talked about. So for caregivers, there's that extra layer of grief, of being the witness to the processes and the trauma that our loved ones experience, especially when they're going through treatment, whether that be for iron deficiency, whether that be for skin conditions, ulcers, cancer, whatever that process may be. If there's nobody to verbalize that this is what grief looks like, this is how it can show up in your body, then that can lead to a compounded burnout. And it's not just that your body is like shattered, but it's also your mind, your spirit, and what you talked about before, where when your children aren't there, you're having these crashes where you've got nothing left. There's nothing in the tank to show up for yourself. And I want to go into what you named so beautifully was the long goodbye nobody prepares you for. How do you describe grief in caregiving or in everyday life? What does it actually feel like from the inside when somebody is going to pass and you're anticipating that grief that's coming?
Well, I think there's a level of my brain that completely shut that down as a child. Now, having sat with people just in high school, I used to work in a nursing home. I was a certified nursing assistant. I did home health care later as an adult, where I had patients that I went to go see who were on hospice. It's like the body knows what's coming. I can correlate it, I think, with my experience before addressing my grief. It took me 30 years. And when I got on the plane and when I was actually there and I was going through this method that helped me with my grief, I got physically very sick, diarrhea, vomiting. And I'd met a person on the tour bus the day before who was there for a life coaching conference. And we ate the exact same meal at the exact same place, and she was absolutely fine. It was like my body knew what was coming. I think that's what happens. Again, I can't remember for me as a child, but I feel like naturally, like we feel anxious, right? We don't know what to expect. We don't want to be there for that person wrong. We don't want to do it wrong. We don't know exactly what to say. And so either we say nothing or we say all these things that we try to just get everything out then, right? Like you just want to say it all because no one prepares us for death. We're not prepared for it. We're taught how to acquire things and people, but not what to do when we lose them. And even if you've had years to prepare, quote, prepare, the moment it happens is still final, and you have no idea what that moment will actually feel like. So I honestly don't like the labels, anticipatory grief, or all these other labels that are kind of tossed around because it's grief. It's just grief. I don't think we need more labels in our society. It's not helpful. It can help someone, I guess, feel understood maybe. But again, if we understood grief, we would understand it's just grief. And that's why I'm so passionate about talking about grief all the live long day, because I just grew up in such a misinformed household and decade and society. And I can recognize how different our children's lives can be if, as adults, we are less afraid of looking at our own wounds. And like a cat, I don't know why this came to me. When a cat is wounded, what does it do? It licks its own wounds. I don't know why that just came to me, why that analogy came to me, but I think we need to get back to caring for our own wounds because that is the impact and that is the ripples of the people in our lives. The worst has already happened, a diagnosis, a death, what have you, whatever it is. That's already happened. You can't change it. You can't erase it. You can't turn back the clock. But if you look at it with the perspective of the worst has already happened, how can I move forward? Even if it's hour by hour, day by day. And I think a part of that is to develop a resiliency as an adult that we were not taught as children because it was just expected of us, but we were actually never taught how to actually be resilient, like what that actually takes.
And I think you really named it before when you said that nobody educates us around how to cope with death, how to cope with grief that enters our life. And it's not something that's openly discussed either. It's something that we have to come to in delicate conversations when we're talking about end of life care, when we're talking about somebody not ever being able to achieve something. Nobody actually talks about how to acknowledge it, how to recognize it when it comes up for you. What happens and who do you seek support from in that space? And I think that's really important for people to hear everywhere, including in caregiving, is that grief is not something that we're educated for. Grief isn't something that we are cushioned to understand. So there's no softness in that experience. And when grief is experienced, it's shattering at times, particularly if it's a loved one who's passed, it's unexpected, or it's coming, but they were a significant part of your life, and how to manage the distance that death or grief creates in that space. And I'm really intrigued by what you mean when you say grief sensitive support. What helps without trying to rush someone into acceptance or positivity?
Well, I think the toxic positivity, we call it in society now, I think it's this rush. Again, I think it comes back to we'd rather feel better than feel our pain. So it's this rush to Pollyanna in a way. Look at the silver lining. I became an expert at looking at the silver lining. I think that was how I coped. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I knew every drink special every night of the week. So it's like I was great at finding the silver lining, but yet I was also abusing alcohol. It's like, how do you reconcile that? But we do. Our minds are really crafty that way. But like you said, and like I think the theme of this podcast is the body remembers, the body knows, and it's always speaking to us. We are an energetic being, and emotions, our energy, and we have a lot of say in what those thoughts are and what those feelings either prompt us to do or not do. And so either we, like I said before, either stuff down, sweep under the rug, avoid, run away from, or we choose differently. We choose to do grief differently. And that's to look at the shadows of our experience, look at the difficult conversations that were never had or that we wish we could have had. Grief is the loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations. It's anything that you wish would be or could have been different, better, or more. So it's a lot more than just death. And by the time you become a caregiver to your aging parent or to a child or what have you, you've already had a lot of rocks you've probably put in your backpack. And we just are not taught, again, how to let that boulder go, releasing it and carrying forward the knowledge and the tools, but also I think it's empowering when you feel confident that regardless of what life is going to throw at you, that you can get through it. Not to say it's easy, right? But yeah, it's never easy. And I think it's the hard things that shape us. And I think that's true of all helpers. All helpers, I think, have gone through something. Advocates, people like you are doing beautiful work in your life as a caregiver to so many different people. And one of the things that I learned personally is that it's when life is lifing, that's when we need to double down on our self-care. And I'm a mom of 3, and I haven't had to be the caregiver like you in the shoes that you are in. I did have a brief experience with my son. We didn't know what was going to happen. Long story short, had a bench pressing accident and ended up with 30% of his pancreas left. But he was in and out of the hospital for 6 weeks. It sounds like it was only 6 weeks, right? Some women, some mothers, they're in caregiver roles for years, for decades. And I know people in my life who have in those shoes. And I look back and it was only 6 weeks, but to my body, that experience at the time, it felt like 6 years. And I didn't realize the impact of that actually until this past year. There was still emotional residue left from that experience. I still, to this day, and it was over a 3-hour drive to the hospital that he had to go to because no one close would take his case. And every time I see that hospital, it's like this PTSD. It brings me back to that experience. So I understand what you were saying in that regard. So I have deep respect and empathy for the caregivers who, like you, show up every single day because it is self-love, self-sacrifice, and a level of love that those on the receiving end, it's a gift.
When you're talking about the emotional residue that's left over from any traumatic or emotionally charged experience, it's so resonated so truly with me when you said that driving past the hospital, having experiences that bring us back. And there was a American TV program called Amsterdam, and one of my children had an AVM rupture in his brain. And it was a couple of years later. And as a caregiver, when you're aware that something has caused emotional distress, tears that you've had to hide, fear that someone's not going to pull through, you do try and address it so that it doesn't linger and create additional distress in new situations that are most likely going to occur. And they had children on there who had the same thing. And I was sitting on the couch bawling my eyes out because it brought me right back to that room, the diagnosis, them telling you that this information. And I was talking with someone this morning and they talked to me about the bad news room in hospitals, that they take you away from your loved one so they don't hear what the bad news is, and they take you into very clinical, no comfort, it's very harsh lighting, harsh everything. And it is really a bad room to be told information. And when you get taken in there, you're like, okay, bracing. But there is not even support in that space. There's nobody saying, hey, we know this is going to be devastating. And we know as a parent, you're going to have to pull your P's and Q's together and push through and pretend like everything's hunky dory so that you're not terrifying your loved one. And that's one of the hardest parts is that caregivers lose things too. Not because they're selfish, but because caregiving changes as life progresses. And I wanted to talk about the invisible losses. What are some of the most common ones you see in caregiving? And if I could give you some examples around identity, friendship or social loss, marriage and partnership intimacy, career momentum, financial safety. One of the big ones is health, sleep, nervous system steadiness, and what's the future going to look like. What would you say are the most common ones that you see in the work that you do with people and grief?
Well, since I'm dealing with individuals, I would say I always try to focus on the individual. It's always about the individual. So I think when we are not caring for ourselves, like that's everything. It's like the domino, because that's where we find our resiliency in all those other areas. I mean, that's what I learned for myself in that going through that period, but that's what I would say. The dot that I would connect, I guess, is that if we took care of that thing, all the other things would feel less heavy, or we would have the stamina, right? We would have the mental agility or emotional capacity. I really think it starts with the individual. I think that is the most important, starting with the caregiver and where they're at. Everything flows from that. It's almost, I was in the military too. Everything starts from the top down. And I think that's the same when it comes to caregiving and to what you described.
Would you say that in our life, like from our experiences in children, where we might lose somebody or we have a traumatic experience that's negative in our life, that these experiences then compound when we don't address them? When we don't, or we are unable to recognize in that pathway that we're actually experiencing grief, and that compounds to then create, as you said, a boiled kettle to explode or implode because we haven't been taught that you need to pause, address it, so that then it's not being carried with you. And I think one of the biggest things that causes like guilt and shame is actually being able to say, I'm struggling, I need support in a way that doesn't turn into more advice or being fixed. How can caregivers seek out the right type of support so that they don't have to feel those experiences and those emotions?
Well, I'll say the first part of your statement with the compound, I actually talk about like healing and looking after yourself and emotional, physical, spiritual, all those areas of our self-care. That's compound interest. I like to compare it to money. We didn't get to where we are overnight. We can't expect to get where we want to be overnight either. And so it's the littlest things that are our compound interest when it comes to healing and feeling better and feeling resilient and feeling more stable and grounded. So that's the first thing I would say to that first part of what you were talking about.
So how can caregivers ask for support in a way that doesn't turn into more advice or being fixed? No shame, no guilt.
So I think that sometimes the family members are maybe not the best people, because what I have learned and what I have found is that the people in your life, anyone that has skin in your game, they're going to give you advice or support that may work in their favor, right? Like it's not going to impact them. People are afraid of other people changing. It's uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable when the people around us change, and even if it's for the better, because we act as a mirror for others. So it shows other people maybe what we've all experienced it, right? Like you're in a room with people and you compare yourself. We just do. We tend to compare ourselves. So it's so easy for us to pick out the flaws in someone else, but really that's something that we feel within ourselves. That's probably not even a flaw in the other person. It's just what we're seeing, what we're picking up on, but it's within ourselves. It's just being mirrored to us. And so that's where I think people that have skin in your game of life are probably not the best people to support you necessarily. Now, do you have people in your life, though, who have done their own work, who have done their own deep personal work, who have developed their emotional IQ, so to speak, who have shown resiliency in their own life, not performative resiliency, but true resiliency. I think there's a big difference in that. And that's what I would look to. Look to the examples of people who not necessarily, I'll say this, who don't have it all together and can admit when they are struggling themselves. That's the co-pilot that you want. Someone who can sit in it with you and who isn't pretending that they have it all together.
I think that is an important difference in approach to seeking support, especially when generally it's really raw. The wound within is raw and it's hard to talk about, and to be frankly honest about what's going on inside. You need that neutral ground of no judgment, of being able to sit and witness it with you without making you feel like you're doing something wrong. You shouldn't be in the space that you are. You should be stronger. You should have everything held together all the time. And I think finding that gentle kindness in being able to be present but not be judged by it is really important in any space of caregiving or personal grief journey. And I'd really like us to take a moment to look at small, kind next steps and language that caregivers can borrow before we wrap up our conversation today. Can you tell me what are 3 tiny next steps caregivers can take this week to honor grief without being swallowed by it?
I would say take a Post-it note, simple Post-it note, not very big. I'm not talking a big sheet, just a Post-it note where you can write 3 things, 3 non-negotiables for your self-care in whatever feels good. It sounds so cliche, but if you think of yourself like a plant, and I'm sure you have plants in your house.
I do, yes.
What's interesting is I never had plants until I actually started to care for myself. I just realized that. Anyway, I love plants now. I'm kind of an addict right now with the plants. I have literally like a plant room. My kids are always telling me, no more plants. Anyway, think of yourself as a plant. And what do you need? You need hydration, you need sunlight, and what else do you need? Fertilizer, right? Nourishment. So basic. Let's get to basics. I mean, that's when, again, it comes back to when life is lifing. What are the basics? And when the sun goes down, what do flowers do? They close up, they rest. Think of yourself like a tulip. I think that's the best recommendation I could possibly give. It's so simple. Sometimes it's the simplest thing. Well, I don't have time. Where am I going to find the time? Even if you have your loved one with you that you're caring for, sit outside. They're a plant too, right? In this metaphor, like, they need sunlight, they need hydration, they need nourishment, like all the things that you give to your loved one. Why is it so hard for us to give to ourselves?
That's very true, because at the end of the day, we generally are at the bottom of the list. So it's time to amend that and put us at the top of the list so that we can trickle down the love and support that we need to give. And I think that honoring yourself and recognizing that nourishment, sleep, rest, and self-appreciation is really important. Making sure that you've got all of the essentials is a great place to start, because when you're in the midst of the grief, it's hard to see the next best step. So if the next best step is having a sip of water, if the next best step is sitting down and closing your eyes because you need a rest, know that there is no judgment, no shame, no guilt attached with having the basic needs of life met, and for you to be supported in that. And if someone wants to support a caregiver, what's one phrase that helps and one that usually harms when we're talking about grief?
Today, you are doing the best that you can. What I would say, what's hurtful or harmful is I think alluding to the idea that God doesn't give you more than you can handle. That's not helpful. Another idea, this just came to me too, and so I'm going to share it because it popped in my mind. But if you, as a caregiver, know of other caregivers who are in a similar, doesn't even have to be the same situation or experience, but an understanding of what you're going through and vice versa. I think just as like when we're in the child rearing years, sometimes I think it's becoming more popular actually, where parents will swap. Like, I'll take your kids today, you take mine tomorrow, and I can have some me time. Why can't that apply to caregivers who are in like a situation like yours, or having a life experience where it is something that there is like no expiration date on this. This is how it is, and this is my life. And how can I bring in the support to help me get those moments of the post-it note? And I feel like if you can create a network or community of caregivers in similar shoes where you can do that, right? Like, I can take your responsibilities for an hour or two, vice versa, you can take mine, and someone you trust, of course.
It's a really like foundational thought to seek others who have the same skill set or the same experience. And even if that means that they can't do self-care, like they can't be on like left alone, but they could do self-care together in the support where they come together and they're in the same space and they can just be supportive of each other, and it's not just all on the one person to keep momentum going. We've had found a really grounded conversation today about grief, how it shows up in different stages of your life, and how caregivers can be supported through that when grief doesn't just mean somebody has passed away. Where can listeners find you and your work if grief is something that they're experiencing in this stage of their life?
Everything's on my website, theunleashedheart.com. Got a lot of free resources there. Some meditations I've created are there. And yeah, all the links to all the things.
I'll make sure that I add all of Victoria's links in the show notes of our conversation today so that you can find her easily and you don't have to remember her website whilst you're listening. I wanted to say thank you so much, Victoria. This conversation was gentle and honest, and I know it will land with caregivers who feel like they have to stay strong even when they're quietly grieving. Today, we named the grief that doesn't come with a funeral. We talked about the invisible loss and the long goodbye nobody prepares you for. And we talked about what it can look like to live alongside grief without rushing it, fixing it, or forcing meaning before you're ready. If you're listening and you feel tearful, numb, irritated, or exhausted, you're not doing it wrong. You might just be carrying something that deserves acknowledgement. One small, kind next step is enough. To everyone listening, thank you for spending this time with us. You don't have to hold it all alone. I'm Michelle, and this is Radiant Moments Caregiver Oasis. Until next time, take gentle care of your radiant moments and of yourself.